Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to the Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 10 of season 6 of HBO's Game of Thrones. Join me, won't you? And just like that, another season of Game of Thrones comes to an end, leaving us to, for the next 10 months, speculate, theorize, hope, dream, and of course dread just a little bit as to what's coming next. But before we start looking ahead, let's go and reflect for a moment on this season 6 finale titled The Winds of Winter. Now, wow, there's a lot to say about this episode, but I think one of the first things that jumped out to me about it was just the fact that more than any other episode of this season, this really was the most overt example as to what David and Eby were trying to do with the show in the 6th season, something that actually Qyburn summed up quite well when he said, "Sometimes before you usher in the new, the old must be put to rest." And though in the show is obviously referring to old Grandmaster and his imminent demise at the hands of these candy-obsessed little birdies, in a broader sense, it also felt like it was referring to old George R. R. Martin's plot lines, complexities, and nuances, and their imminent demise at the hands of these endgame-obsessed showrunners. But on this episode specifically, it was really tough because there were elements and scenes throughout that were both extremely thrilling to watch because they were so well executed, but also sometimes just so frustrating to watch because they were so carelessly sprinted to or past, and I really don't want to undersell or oversell either of those truths on this review, but with that in mind, let's jump on in. Straight away, I loved almost every second of the near 20-minute opening montage, which in a way felt like almost a direct response to the Stark sigil having replaced the Boltons at Winterfell, really making us wonder who would be taking on that mantle of the show's central villain now that Ramsay was dead. Of course, I'm not saying that for certain will be Cersei, or that Euron, theoretically possessing this sort of dragon kryptonite, so to speak, in his dragon horn, won't be able to step up in a big way, or that Littlefinger won't be able to more wholly corrupt Sansa, or that Dany still couldn't become the Mad Queen were she to lose Tyrion as her advisor. But this episode did do a really great job of pushing Cersei in that direction. And it wasn't just that Cersei killed her enemies, or incinerated dozens, if not hundreds of innocent bystanders, or explained to Sept Olenna how many of her horrible actions were really done merely because they felt good, but that she, after allowing Tommen, likely her most fragile and impressionable child, watch as the woman he loved and the faith he had just been coerced into believing go up in flames, didn't immediately go to him, comfort him, and protect him. That, to me, spoke most clearly of her brokenness and blindness, and something too that I thought was handled quite well in the writing, because Cersei wasn't yet malevolent enough to just send the Mountain to go and kill her son, even if he had betrayed her. No, from what we have been shown, she still loved her last remaining child, and it was really his life that kept her soul intact. Which is why, now that he's dead, I would not be surprised at all if over the next couple of seasons we watch her very rapid descent into madness, up until the point when Jaime is forced to take on the new mantle of the Queenslayer. It is now just way too poetic to pass up. And also, I really have to commend the pacing, the rather bold pacing of this entire opening sequence, because we've kind of known for a while now, if not this entire season, that Cersei would at some point exact her revenge on the Sparrows. And also, kind of mainly due to some heavy-handed writing in the last couple episodes, knew that it would in some way involve wildfire. And yet, this episode still chose to build to that epic, explosive conclusion in a way that it deserved. And integral in heightening that kind of tragic inevitability was Ramin Djawadi's score, really making death less of an if and who, and more of a when and how many. Honestly, not since Bear McCreary's Battlestar Galactica score have I heard a composer put together such unique and strong sounds, really creating this truly one-of-a-kind musical landscape. But let's go and talk about the who from that scene just for a moment, considering this may well be the last time we ever see Margaery and Loras, unless, of course, Bran wargs back in time and saves the both of them. But with Loras, it was interesting, and so this show, that it wouldn't even use his confessing to depravity, dishonesty, profligacy, and arrogance to make him completely black in our eyes, by making the one to whom he was confessing anything but white. But for me, it was Margaery's presence in that scene and learning that she was in fact just playing the High Sparrows game that really lent it some stakes, because I knew that things were going to go kablooey and that Lancel Lannister didn't stand a chance of extinguishing those candles in time. But I did think that perhaps Margaery could make it out before things got all wild and green, and it was not knowing that that really kept me on the edge of my seat all throughout that long build-up. Ironically, the arguably even larger revelation of who Jon's parents were kind of received no build-up this episode. I mean, poor Jon Snow. Nearly every one of his climactic, long-awaited moments was horribly anticlimactic this season, which again likely came from the fact that many of them were all but confirmed, leading the showrunners to really axe what they thought to be needless build-up. But even as I was slightly let down that we only cut back to Bran to watch him once again say goodbye to Uncle Benjen, whose kind of good zombie existence really does raise some interesting questions, and that Bran's discovery really did nothing solely in his hands, I will give it this, which is actually also my answer to this week's Twitter question, which comes to us from Brooke Pablo, who writes, "So what are the repercussions of Jon being named King of the North with Sansa and Littlefinger?" Well, it was interesting to note that they cut almost directly from Bran's vision to Lady Mormont saying, "I don't care that he's a bastard. Ned Stark's blood runs through his veins." And with Jon being declared King of the North in a scene very reminiscent of Robb Stark's own crowning, so to speak, back in episode 10 of season 1, he's now become a very clear obstacle for Littlefinger, which is exactly what he warned Sansa would happen. And just as a side note, I've got to say the relationship between those three remains one of the most compelling and nuanced parts of the show right now. Just watching Sansa go back and forth with a relationship with Littlefinger and a relationship with Jon, this is a girl with some serious daddy issues, which is why for the most part I still find her character to be unpredictable and believable. So even as they stood together on the ramparts of Winterfell, Sansa apologizing to Jon for keeping him in the dark about her and Littlefinger's plans, the director still very intentionally chose to put that wall between them. And even as she, thank goodness, rejected Littlefinger's advances, shutting down his dream of ruling with her by his side, it was still so clear from the looks they exchanged while the houses rallied behind Jon that Lord Baelish's words about the power that Sansa deserved were still ringing in her ears. But again, Jon and Sansa also have a connection that is genuine. You could really see it in that simple moment where they talked about the appearance of the first White Raven and how that announced the arrival of winter. But it is a connection that very clearly undermines what Littlefinger is trying to do, which makes me think he's really going to try and dissolve it as quickly as possible going forwards. But back to Bran, I do want to talk about his wargame just a moment longer. Now, this is something that does happen on television shows quite often, where they do recycle the same VFX shot just to save on money. But on Game of Thrones, where that is much less of an issue, it does make it interesting to then note that Bran was actually seeing the future when he saw the wildfire erupting beneath King's Landing. Going forwards, it will be interesting to see how much he'll warg into the future and into the past, and if he'll continue to develop his ability to interact with both. So for example, what if the whispers that drove the Mad King mad were in fact Bran attempting to get through to him and change the past? And even if that specific example doesn't come to pass, I hope something like it does, because it's exactly something like that that I felt was missing from the Tower of Joy scene. As cool as it was to get that revelation, it was also kind of dull just watching Bran act as that sort of passive bystander. Another Stark, though, who was anything but a passive bystander this week, though, was Arya. Her return to Westeros and assassination of Walder Frey being another one of the most surprising moments of the episode. Unfortunately, in this instance, though, the reason it was so surprising is I found it to be kind of almost completely unbelievable. Yes, the fact that she executed such a horrible character was satisfying, and yes, the act itself, in a cool way, continued to put into question what kind of person this once innocent character is becoming. And yes, once again, the director did his darndest to build into that moment in this specific episode. But it also took all of my might not just to think, man, I'm being a little bit robbed of an even more satisfying and epic conclusion for this character, because this entire situation just begs the question, how did Arya get all the way from Braavos back to Westeros and then travel all the way to Riverrun in such a short amount of time? And of course, the same sorts of questions were just bouncing around my mind as we saw Lady Tyrell and Varys show up in Dorne so quickly. But at the same time, even more than that, I just kept thinking this is yet another instance where this episode is really giving us what we thought we wanted versus what we, in this moment, actually needed. Too focused on uniting the Tyrells, the Sands, and the Targaryens against the Lannisters, instead of illuminating what happened after Alyria's revolt and how the people of Dorne responded to that coup, or even how and when Olenna discovered the news of her family. And speaking of revelations, probably one of my favorite scenes in the episode, if only because I love Davos so much and love seeing him stand up against Melisandre and force her to reveal to Jon what she did to Shireen. And seeing her response too is just a great extension of what she's gone through this season. Humbled, yes, but also as dogmatic as ever. It's also just fun to theorize where exactly Melisandre might be heading. Considering that she's heading south, she may actually end up running into the Hound and Beric Dondarrion, as well as the rest of the Brotherhood without banners. Or maybe, just maybe, as a penance, she's going to go and resurrect Lady Stoneheart? This entire episode, though, wasn't just one massive revelation after the next, in some moments actually acting as a nice denouement to last week's insanity. So Sam's storyline, for example, where we got to see him, almost like Belle in Beauty and the Beast, walk into that library at Hightower, was such a great change of pace. And I can't deny that my own face was a bit like Sam's watching Dany aboard those ships, finally sailing to Westeros. And I've got to say, the way that the writers chose to get Dany to that point in this specific episode, I thought to be decently well handled, because initially I thought they were going to make her departure from Rheon, a place that she, and by extension we, had invested a lot of time and effort, actually feel like a significant loss by forcing her to leave Daario there, which in the scene where she rejected him did feel like a solid idea and a decent effort. But for me, what really worked a lot better and made things a lot more interesting was the next scene between her and Tyrion, where she explained to him that she felt nothing about making him stay, and consequently nothing about leaving this city behind. It was almost as if the writers were giving us, the audience, permission to say, yeah, I don't feel anything for the city either, and I am so thankful that these characters can finally say, forget you, Marine, we're going to another place that we've wanted to go for a long time. And also another scene that was just Again, thrilling, but also rather frustrating was the one between Tyrion and Dany. It was genuinely thrilling and moving to watch their trust grow for one another. Even in that scene, as the director opened with that wide shot demonstrating their emotional distance, and then later pushing in on Tyrion as he confessed that he actually, for once in his life, had something and someone to believe in. But it was also so frustrating that beyond that wonderful moment of Tyrion and the dragons back in episode 2, we hadn't really gotten a strong sense of why he believed in this woman, or how she had in any way earned that. At the end of the day, though, I actually feel like I have just a little bit more hope for this narrative in its television form in seasons 7 and 8, because in a lot of ways, season 6, if David and DB were going to finish things in the amount of time that they'd already determined, it had to be the one where they consolidated, shoehorned, concluded, and rushed through numerous plot lines, characters, and developments, which, having invested 5 years into them, was often rather frustrating, but now seeing how this season ended, in this comparatively neat, clear, and plainly drawn fashion, right down to the symmetry found in the final shots of all the key players, I do feel like watching them continue on in what is now a more simplistic story will potentially be much less aggravating and more rewarding. So did I, at the end of season 5, still feel like the show was only halfway through its run, and even with a theoretical season 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, still really have to focus to ensure it was going to conclude all its storylines in a satisfying way? Absolutely. But if that's not what David and DB are interested in, then I think I'm glad they've gotten to this tightened narrative sooner than later, and will hopefully be allowed to focus on making the main characters as interesting, nuanced, conflicted, and believable as they were when they were first handed off to them by George R.R. Martin. And with only 13 more episodes to go, they're probably going to have a couple more red weddings and blow up a few more seps just to ensure we can give some real meaty development to Tyrion, Dany, Jon, Jaime, Cersei, Arya, Sansa, Bran, Brienne, Littlefinger, Jorah, Bronn. Yeah, there's still a lot of them to deal with, but I do want to end this thing on a positive note, guys. I do still have hope that this show can end in a satisfying way, and this episode specifically really did demonstrate to me, once again, in its deliberate pacing and as stellar as ever direction, acting, and cinematography, that they can give us some really great bang for our buck moments in the final 2 seasons before the show comes to its, hopefully, epic conclusion. Those are my thoughts, anyways, on this week's finale of Game of Thrones. I would definitely love to know what you guys thought of the episode, so definitely comment below and let me know. Now, before I close things out, I kind of wanted to pitch to you guys an idea that I'm rather excited about. Now, between now and next April, when season 7 airs, I'm going to do my darndest, anyways, to read all of the A Song in Ice and Fire books. Thank you, Kevin Moore, for finally pushing me to do so. But I'm actually curious, so the rest of you guys, would you at all be interested in kind of walking through that process with me? Would you find it interesting if I did the occasional video blog kind of comparing and contrasting the books to the television series, or maybe just talking about adaptations in general and what makes a good adaptation as compared to a not so good adaptation? Definitely comment below and let me know if you'd be at all interested in that content. Also, definitely hop on over to patreon.com, because it's for projects like this that I really need your guys' passionate input and support, because this has never only been about my ideas and what I'm passionate about, but what we're passionate about, and that's what I'm really trying to do over on patreon.com. I'm trying to unite with you guys, get to know all of you a bit better, and figure out what we can accomplish together. Finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.